Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and these are the 10 worst cards from Knights of the Frozen Throne. I already covered the best cards from the expansion, but it can also be helpful to talk about the worst cards in a given expansion, just to save people some time when it comes to crafting cards, trying to include these cards in their deck. Essentially, you know that these are the kinds of cards that you can avoid when going through that deck building or crafting process, or maybe that you can disenchant these cards because it looks very unlikely that any of these are ever going to be successful inclusions in an actual competitive deck in Hearthstone. Now, to determine this list, I did actually go to the data. I went to hsreplay.net and looked at the cards with both the lowest win rates, but also the lowest win rates of decks that they're played in. So these are cards that are both bad when they hit the board, but also apparently really reduce the consistency and impact of your deck as well. Now, as far as the order is concerned, it was really hard to determine a real specific order, so I just used my judgment for placing these cards where they go in the list. But quite clearly, as the data suggests, these are legitimately some of the worst cards in Hearthstone and the bottom of the barrel when it comes to this expansion. So let's go ahead and jump into this list. Starting off at the number 10 spot, we have the Vrykul, a 3-mana 3/1 with a death rattle. If it's your opponent's turn, summon a 2/2 ghoul. This is a theme that we've seen in this expansion a handful of times with other cards that are successful, like Venomancer. The problem with Vrykul is that even that death rattle doesn't have enough upside. Venomancer for only 2 more mana, it gives you an 8/8 that pops out on the back end of its death rattle, and that is worth experimenting with. That's worth buffing, for instance, with Spike Ridge Steed and forcing your opponent to summon you an 8/8. There's enough upswing and enough potential value there. With Vrykul, there's just not. There's other 3-mana death rattle cards that do a similar thing. For instance, when you compare this to the classic card Harvest Golem, you can see why Vrykul is so bad. That's a guaranteed death rattle. This one's a conditional one that your opponent really doesn't have to activate, and just getting a 3-attack minion on turn 3 doesn't do anything for you either. So this looks worse than Harvest Golem. It looks worse than Scarlet Crusader. There are so many different cards this looks worse than. There's no surprise that there's really no reason to run this in any given deck. Moving on to my number 9 spot, it's the first and only legendary card on this list, which is actually a little bit of a relief because in the Unguro set that I did this exact same video for a month or two ago, unfortunately there were a lot of legendaries because many of the quests from Journey to Unguro were really bad. As it turns out, most of the Death Knights and most of the class cards in Frozen Throne aren't necessarily amazing, but they're not terrible. They're not the worst cards of the set, except perhaps for Murabi, which is actually really disappointing to me. I thought there might be a little bit of life in that freeze-style Shaman deck, and perhaps, who knows, there might be in the future as Blizzard releases more freeze cards. Of course, once they pick an archetype, they usually try to make it work really, really hard until it sticks, and I guess we'll see if that's the case with Shaman. But as it stands right now, Freeze Shaman just doesn't make sense. This is not going to be the only Freeze Shaman-related card on this list. Little spoiler alert there. But even Murabi's, potential really high card resource value game where you can give you tons of resources of both your own or of your opponent's from freezing stuff. It's just too slow, it's too passive, it's not OP enough for Hearthstone where you have to do things that are really overpowered and typically much faster and more instant on the board to really make an impact. So Murabi ends up being a slow card that's far too conditional and a part of an archetype that just doesn't make any sense. Moving on to the number 8 spot, we have the Spell Weaver, the 6-mana spell damage card, and that really sums up the problems with this one. That's a lot of mana to spend on a spell damage gain. Typically, when you're wanting spell damage, you need that remaining mana to actually utilize your spell damage. You want to be able to cast a Fireball and a Frostbolt and all these other things together so that you can make that spell damage really high impact. We used to see that in the past with, for instance, Evolved Kobold. And when you compare Evolved Kobold versus Spellweaver, they look kind of similar as far as stats and costs are concerned. This is just a slightly scaled up version of the Evolved Kobold. But that makes all the difference. Having to waste that 2 extra mana on the same kind of effect is just such a downside because you really don't care about the body, and this is not the kind of card you can preemptively play and hope that your opponent just doesn't answer it because clearly they're going to know that's your game plan and focus on resources, and at only 4 health, this just isn't enough of a threat on its own to substantiate that preemptive kind of play. It's too expensive to play at the same time, leaving Spellweaver without any sort of home or sensible way to utilize it, making it a failed card. Moving on to the number 7 spot, we have the Knight Howler, 4 mana, 3/4, and whenever it takes damage, it gains +2 attack. So I guess you could put this card in the same vein as the Gurubashi Berserker or Frothing Berserker. When it takes damage, it gets a little bit bigger, but unfortunately, it kind of lives in between both of those cards, and I think, in fact, is worse than both of those cards. The Gurubashi Berserker, of course, has way more health to work with, so it's a little bit more difficult for your opponents to handle. The Frothing Berserker for Warrior, on the other hand, has much less of a conditional effect. It's not when it takes damage. That card works when everything takes damage, so it can high roll much, much higher than this card ever could. So unless you buff this thing and pull off some crazy shenanigans, it's just not much of a threat. And then even at its base stats, 3/4 for 4 is very weak. That's below the vanilla curve. So there's no deck that can really utilize this in a sensible way without better alternatives. It just feels like one of those tweener style cards that is not high impact enough, and that is why it's fallen through the cracks as one of the worst cards in the set. Moving on to the number 6 spot, we have yet another Shaman Freeze card, and it's still not the last one on the list. But, you know, any card that's a part of a failed archetype, you aren't expecting it to make a big impact in the expansion. And, of course, Icebreaker just doesn't make any sense outside of a free Shaman archetype because the 3-mana 1/3 weapon is terrible. But even then, I think inside of a free Shaman archetype, if that were successful, I feel like Icebreaker would still have some challenges because it would force you to attack into really big stuff, taking tons of damage. And I think the whole idea of freeze is stalling out and slowing down your opponents. And if those minions that you're freezing get to attack you anyway and still get to apply damage, that's not very good in aggressive decks. So there's a lot of limitations and issues with this card fundamentally as far as I'm concerned. And clearly we still haven't seen free Shaman as a successful deck. So this one just looks really bad and one of the worst freeze cards out there. But it's not the worst freeze card. I think that honor belongs to my number 5 card, Cryostasis. This is a 2-mana spell for Shaman that gives a minion +3/+3 and then freezes that minion. So a little bit of an awkward use case here with this spell, I think. Theoretically, you could use this on your own minions to give them a buff, but of course then you're also denying them the ability to attack, so that's really only good if you're using this on taunt minions or if you're in a very, very slow matchup. If you did want to use this on your opponent's minions, you can, but of course then you're buffing your opponent's minions, and you still have to kill them and deal with them eventually, and then maybe you want to attack into them with your Icebreaker, but then suddenly you're taking an additional 3 damage when you make that attack, and it's a really awkward 2-card removal combo with a lot of downside. So it just feels like this one is a very awkward card to utilize. It doesn't really make sense for something you want to do. So unless Free Shaman becomes incredibly powerful someday, it looks like Cryostasis is just going to be one of those failed cards we never see and often never think about. And it's an epic to boot, so it's incredibly expensive to craft. And it's going to feel like a disappointment if you get this in your packs. It's 100 dust, sure, but there are a lot of good epics out there. Cryostasis not being one of them. So a very deserving card as far as failed or bad cards go on this list. So now let's move into the top 4, and this one actually is a surprise to me, but Venomancer, the 5-mana 2/5 poisonous minion, has one of the worst played and deck win rates of any card in the expansion. If you had to go purely by the stats, I honestly think this card would take the number 1 spot as the worst card in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Now, it's hard to make an argument that which one belongs where based on the stats because there just aren't that many games played, and you know, who knows who's playing these cards in the deck, so it's hard to say. So I did take a little bit of a subjective approach and moved this one back to the number 4 spot instead of the number 1 spot, because even though it doesn't look good by any means, it's a pretty flat, boring card, it doesn't look absolutely terrible, because a poisonous minion with 5 health for 5 mana, you know, theoretically a 5/5, something like that, essentially, because it, you know, poisonous can trade up very, very effectively. So it doesn't look brokenly terrible by any means, but clearly still a fairly weak card that doesn't have any sort of place. It's my Exna, essentially, from Naxxramas, which was always a really terrible legendary that never saw any play, but it doesn't have the beast tag, and the stats are just a tad worse, even though the mana cost is a little lower as well. But ultimately, just nobody needs this big of a poisonous minion. The advantage of poisonous is trading up a small thing into a big thing, and if you're spending 5 mana on your poisonous effect, then you're trading up, sort of a medium, or maybe arguably even a big thing into a big thing, which feels far worse. So the upside of the poisonous is gone, and then you lose the upside of the stats in trade. So yet another awkward card that just nobody needs and nobody wants to play. So it shows up on this list at the number 4 spot. So now let's move into the top 3 with the card I think everybody expected to see on this list. This is the Ticking Abomination. This was really the centerpiece of the expansion reveal season, because we got some cards teased and then we waited a few weeks, and the very next card revealed was Ticking Abomination, and everybody was like, okay, I guess this is Frozen Throne. We have a 4-mana 5/6 minion that deals 5 damage to your side of the board when it dies. And this was quickly identified as a pretty terrible looking card. Ton of people tried to stand up for this one and make excuses for why it might actually be good. It turns out none of those excuses were very valid. It is in fact a bad card. It has terrible stats to support that data. And just looking at it, I think you can still tell this is a 1-star card. It doesn't make any sense. The upside of the stats is not worth the downside of the death rattle. Not even in Arena, certainly not in Constructed. So Ticking Abomination, it is in fact a bad card. It is an abomination. It's one of the worst cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne. But it's not the worst. The stats suggest there are 2 cards even worse than Ticking Abomination, the second of which is Wicked Skeleton, the 4-mana 1/1 with a battle cry that gives it +1/+1 for each minion that died this turn. A 4-mana 5/6, not good enough. Certainly a 4-mana 1/1 is not good enough either. There's just a lot of trouble making this card work. Even if somehow you trade in 4 minions and you play your Wicked Skeleton, you get a 4-mana 5/5. And a 4-mana 5/5 is only slightly better than Chillwind Yeti. You trade in 6/7 minions, sure, you could get a 4-mana 7/7, for instance. But even 4-mana 7/7s don't get played in Shaman these days, so 4-mana 7/7's not even overpowered enough for Hearthstone these days. And those are absolute best case scenarios. Usually on turn 3, there aren't 6 minions dying. And a lot of times on turn 4, when you want to play Wicked Skeleton, guess what? Nothing dies. There's just no minions that are dead, which means you're playing a 4-mana 1/1, which is probably the worst imaginable thing you can do on any given turn 4 in any game of Hearthstone. So essentially, this effect is way too inconsistent, too unpredictable, and far too unreliable. Usually this is a 4-mana 2/2, 4-mana 3/3, the kind of card you don't want to play that doesn't make any sort of sense. So the risk of running this is far, far greater than the very slight potential for reward that you'd ever see, because that happens 1 out of 20 games. The other 19 games, you are playing an absolutely miserable card. And if I could click correctly, the data suggests exactly that. Wicked Skeleton is an abject failure. But it's actually not the worst card in the expansion, and this one has surprised me. But if you look at the data for the deck win rate and the win rate when a card is played, to me, Leeching Poison stood out as the worst card in all of Knights of the Frozen Throne. Now, I think a lot of people out there are going to come to this card's defense and explain why it's good for some reason or another. I'm fine with that. Go ahead and make those cases, make that argument. I'm just going by the data, and in my opinion, even just looking at the card, I think when you see it in action, you can understand why. It's just not a high-impact enough card that it always tends to fall short, because giving a weapon lifesteal in Rogue just doesn't do very much. It doesn't affect the board. It doesn't affect tempo. It only gives the Rogue a little bit of healing. And as we've seen, Weapon Rogue is not really a thing yet. There still aren't that many great weapons available to Rogue. Sure, Shadowblade is fine, but it already has some defensive potential added in, giving you immune the turn that you play it, so that's a little bit of life gain. So essentially, to run Leeching Poison successfully, you have to sacrifice a spot in your deck. So, this is a card that you draw that's not another card. It doesn't, immediately help you kill things on the board or kill your opponent. If it heals you, which it's not always even guaranteed to heal you, right? Sometimes you may not heal very much off of this. You have to play it and your opponent just kills you in the meantime because you wasted 2 mana. If it heals you, it's typically only healing you for very tiny amounts of health. So for instance, on your hero power weapon, that's a 1-2, this would heal you for a total of 2 health, which just isn't very much. Even on the Shadow Blade, this would heal you for 6 health. Even on an Assassin's Blade, if you manage to get this out on your Assassin's Blade and attack every single time, that's 12 health. There are clearly some other attack buffs with Deadly Poison and so on and so forth that could increase all of those numbers. But, 8 health, 12 health, still at the end of the day, not all that much health. It's just not fitting of Rogue's game plan, which typically works much better to control the board through early tempo with those backstabs and those SI7 agents and so on and so forth. So sacrificing mana, sacrificing time, sacrificing card draws for a thing that pays back very, very little in regards to tempo, as it turns out, just not worth it to Rogue. It doesn't make sense for their game plan. So unless we see some sort of absurd weapon buff style deck in the future, it looks like Leeching Poison is just too low impact of a card, too slow of a card. And although people always wanted healing for Rogue, and that's probably still something that people want, this card is not the card that's going to satisfy that need. It's just not good enough. And in fact, the data suggests Leeching Poison is the worst card in the entire expansion of Knights of the Frozen Throne, believe it or not. So there you go, guys. Those are my 10 worst cards in Knights of the Frozen Throne. Now, I'm sure some of you will disagree with some of these. I bet somebody out there has found a way to utilize any one of these cards in some deck that has a 93% win rate on the Legend ladder. That's cool. I want to hear about it. So tell me in the comments below how you've made these cards work, why they're a success, what everybody else is missing. You've cracked the puzzle, so share exactly how you're making these cards a success in Ranked Hearthstone, and I will certainly be the first to read it and the happiest to hear about it. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.